The stranger's car was stuck deep in the mud, rain pouring down in sheets as Matthew Harmon trudged through the mire with his old tractor. He had no idea the elegant woman watching from beneath her umbrella was Alexandra Blackwood, heiress to the largest estate in the county. With a friendly wave, he hitched the chain to her luxury SUV, not knowing this simple act of kindness would transform his failing farm into something beyond his wildest dreams. When she handed him her business card with a number scrawled on the back, he almost tossed it away, thinking it was just another empty promise from a city slicker. But that card was about to change everything. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain had been relentless for 3 days. Matthew Harmon stood at the edge of his porch, watching sheets of water hammer his struggling crops. At 34, his weathered face bore the lines of a man who had faced one too many hardships. The small farmhouse behind him had seen better days, with peeling paint and a roof that leaked in 4 different places. Each raindrop seemed to echo the ticking clock of debt that haunted his every waking moment. 6 generations of Harmons had worked this land, but it might end with him. The bank had made it clear 3 more mortgage payments missed, and they would foreclose. Matthew took a swig of his lukewarm coffee, grimacing at both its taste and the bitter reality of his situation. The neighboring farms had all sold out to developers or larger agricultural corporations over the past decade. Only Matthew remained, stubbornly clinging to the family legacy, even as debt mounted and equipment broke down with increasing frequency. His ancient tractor, a John Deere, that had belonged to his grandfather, was held together with wire, determination, and the occasional prayer. Turning to go back inside, a flash of motion caught his eye. Down on the flooded access road that ran along the eastern edge of his property, headlights cut through the rain and fog. A vehicle too sleek and expensive to belong to anyone local was attempting to navigate the washed-out path. Matthew watched as the vehicle slowed, then stopped, its wheels spinning uselessly in the thick mud. "City folk," he muttered, shaking his head. No one with any sense would take that road in this weather. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. He had his own problems, and helping some lost tourist would only delay his evening chores. But something in him, perhaps his father's voice reminding him that Harmons always help those in need, made him set down his coffee mug. "Damn conscience," he grumbled, pulling on his raincoat and mud-caked boots. The rain pelted his face as he made his way to the barn, each drop feeling like a tiny needle against his skin. The familiar smell of hay and motor oil greeted him as he pushed open the creaking door. The tractor sat in the corner, a beast from another era that somehow still answered when called upon. Matthew climbed into the seat, the worn leather molded perfectly to his frame after countless hours in the fields. The engine protested at first with a series of coughs and sputters, before reluctantly roaring to life. He guided the massive vehicle out of the barn and toward the stranded motorist, the large tires cutting through mud that would swallow a normal car whole. As he approached, he could make out the vehicle more clearly, a high-end Range Rover, gleaming despite the mud now splattered across its lower half. It looked absurdly out of place on the rural road, like a diamond dropped in a pig pen. The kind of vehicle that cost more than he'd make in 5 years of good harvests. Behind the wheel sat a woman, her silhouette barely visible through the rain-streaked windows. As Matthew pulled the tractor alongside, she rolled down her window. The face that greeted him was not what he expected. Instead of the panic or frustration he anticipated, she appeared remarkably composed, even amused by her predicament. "Seems I've made a rather poor choice of roads," she called out over the rain. Her voice carried a hint of an accent he couldn't quite place. Not local, certainly, but not quite the urban sharpness he associated with city dwellers. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and even in casual clothing, there was an unmistakable air of sophistication about her. "You could say that," Matthew replied, unable to keep a note of judgment from his voice. "GPS send you this way?" "Something like that," she answered with a slight smile. "That, and an overestimation of this vehicle's capabilities. I don't suppose you could help me out of this mess?" Matthew surveyed the situation. The Range Rover's tires were sunk deeply into the mud, and with the rain still coming down, the situation would only worsen. It would be a straightforward tow job, but not a quick one. "I can pull you out," he said after a moment. "But you'd be better off waiting till morning when the rain might let up." "I'm afraid that's not an option," she replied, glancing at her watch, a simple but undoubtedly expensive timepiece. "I have appointments to keep." Matthew stifled a sigh and nodded. "Let me get my chain." He climbed down from the tractor, immediately sinking ankle-deep in mud. The woman attempted to exit her vehicle as well, but he waved her back. "Stay put. No sense in both of us getting soaked." To his surprise, she ignored his advice, emerging from the car with a large black umbrella that seemed to materialize from nowhere. She wore what looked like hiking boots, practical, but clearly new and expensive, paired with dark jeans and a waterproof jacket that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. "I prefer to see how things are done," she explained, picking her way carefully through the mud to stand near him. "I'm Alexandra, by the way. Alexandra Blackwood." "Matthew Harmon," he grunted, focusing on retrieving the heavy chain from the back of his tractor. The name tickled something in the back of his mind, but he was too preoccupied to place it. Working quickly despite the downpour, Matthew secured one end of the chain to his tractor's hitch and the other to the frame of her vehicle. Alexandra observed the process with interest, holding her umbrella in such a way that it partially sheltered him as he worked. "You've done this before," she commented. Matthew straightened up, wiping rain from his face. "Once or twice, mostly pulling out my own equipment from fields." "You're a farmer then?" "Sixth generation," he replied, a hint of pride creeping into his voice despite his current circumstances. "Though that doesn't mean much these days." "On the contrary," Alexandra said thoughtfully. "I find that quite remarkable in an age where everything seems so impermanent." There was something in her tone, a genuine appreciation that caught Matthew off guard. Before he could respond, he turned back to the task at hand. "You should get back in your car. This might take a few tries." Alexandra complied, folding her umbrella and slipping back into the driver's seat of the Range Rover. Matthew returned to his tractor and began the careful process of extracting her vehicle from the mud's grip. The chain went taut, the tractor's engine strained, and for a moment, it seemed as though the mud might win this battle. Then, with a sudden lurch, the Range Rover began to move, slowly at first, then more steadily as it found purchase on slightly firmer ground. Matthew guided both vehicles carefully until they reached a more stable section of the road, where the gravel base was still somewhat intact beneath the mud. When Alexandra emerged from her car this time, there was a genuine smile on her face. The rain had lessened somewhat, falling now in a gentle patter rather than the earlier deluge. "You've saved me a considerable inconvenience, Mr. Harmon," she said. "How can I repay you?" Matthew was already unhooking the chain, shaking his head. "No need, just being neighborly." "Neighborly," she repeated, as if testing the word. "That's becoming rather rare, in my experience. Please, I insist on compensating you for your time and effort." She reached into her pocket, pulling out what Matthew initially thought was a checkbook. Instead, it was a sleek leather card holder. She extracted a business card and a pen, scribbling something on the back before extending it to him. Reluctantly, Matthew accepted it, glancing briefly at the embossed text. "Alexandra Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Agricultural Enterprises" on the back. She had written a phone number in elegant handwriting, followed DAC. "Bye. Call me AB. I'm not looking for work if that's what this is about," Matthew said, though he pocketed the card nonetheless. Alexandra's expression remained pleasant, but her eyes, sharp and assessing, studied him with new interest. "You misunderstand. That's my personal number, not my company's HR department. I'd like to discuss something with you when you have time." "I'm pretty busy," Matthew replied, a defensive note creeping into his voice. The last thing he needed was charity, or, worse, some corporate pitch about selling his land. "I'm sure you are," she agreed easily. "But I think what I have to propose might be worth your while. No obligation, just a conversation." Before Matthew could formulate a response, she continued, "Is there somewhere nearby I can turn around safely? I believe I'll take the main road back, despite the extra 20 minutes it will add to my journey." The abrupt change of subject threw him off balance. Yes. There's a wider section about 50 yards ahead. You can manage a 3-point turn there. Perfect. Thank you again, Mr. Harmon. She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, he shook it. Her grip was surprisingly firm, her hand warm despite the chilly rain. As she returned to her vehicle, Matthew called out almost without thinking, "The road gets worse before it gets better. You might want to back up to the oak tree and then turn." Alexandra paused, looking back at him with that same assessing gaze. "Good advice. I appreciate it." She hesitated, then added, "I hope you'll call Matthew. I believe we could help each other." Before he could ask what she meant, she was in her car, carefully navigating as he had suggested. Matthew watched as the expensive vehicle disappeared around the bend, its taillights gradually fading into the misty rain. Only later, as he was parking the tractor back in its spot in the barn, did the name click in his mind. Blackwood. The Blackwoods owned nearly half the valley, had for generations. Old money mixed with new ventures, they were practically local royalty, though they kept to themselves mostly. Alexandra Blackwood wasn't just some random city slicker who'd taken a wrong turn. She was probably one of the wealthiest people in the county, and she wanted him to call her. Matthew pulled the card from his pocket, staring at it in the dim light of the barn. Common sense told him to forget the whole encounter. People like Alexandra Blackwood didn't mix with struggling farmers like him without an agenda. And yet, something about her manner, direct but not condescending, had seemed genuine. With a sigh, he tucked the card back into his pocket. He had more immediate concerns: a leaking roof to patch, livestock to check, and the ever-present worry of how to make next month's mortgage payment. Whatever Alexandra Blackwood wanted could wait. But as he walked back to his house through the now gentle rain, the weight of the business card in his pocket seemed heavier than it should have been. 3 days passed before Matthew looked at the card again. The rain had finally stopped, leaving his fields partially flooded and his mood even darker than before. The morning mail had brought another notice from the bank, a reminder of the payment due in 2 weeks, printed on paper that seemed to carry the weight of inevitable failure. He sat at his kitchen table, the ancient wood scarred from generations of Harmon family meals and decisions. The card lay before him, pristine white against the weathered surface. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across fields that needed attention he couldn't afford to give them. The phone felt heavy in his hand as he dialed the number. He'd almost convinced himself she wouldn't answer, that it would go to voicemail, and he could leave a brief message, fulfilling some vague sense of obligation without actually committing to anything. Alexandra Blackwood speaking. Her voice was crisp and clear, as if she'd been expecting his call. Matthew cleared his throat. "Ms. Blackwood, this is Matthew Harmon. I pulled your car out of the mud a few days back." "Mr. Harmon, yes, I'm glad you called." There was genuine warmth in her voice. "I was beginning to think you'd thrown my card away." "Nearly did," he admitted before he could stop himself. A soft laugh came through the line. "Honest, at least. How are your fields after all that rain?" The question surprised him. Most people in her position wouldn't spare a thought for the practical concerns of farming. "Saturated. I'll lose some of the early plantings. Nothing I haven't dealt with before." "I'm sorry to hear that." She paused, and he could hear papers shuffling. "Matthew, I'd like to discuss something with you, but not over the phone. Would you be available for a meeting?" Warning bells sounded in his mind. "What kind of meeting?" "A business proposition that I believe could benefit us both." "Nothing to do with buying your land," she added, as if reading his thoughts. Quite the opposite, in fact. Curiosity, despite his better judgment, stirred within him. "I've got work to do here." "Of course. What about tomorrow evening? I could come to you, save you the trip. Say around 6? Matthew hesitated. Having her come to the farm meant she would see everything: the disrepair, the struggling operation, all the evidence of his failing business. But it also meant he would be on his home ground, with all the psychological advantage that provided. "Tomorrow at 6 works," he said finally. "Excellent. I'll bring dinner unless you'd prefer to eat before?" The casual offer threw him off balance again. "You don't need to do that. I insist. Consider it further. Thanks for your assistance the other day." Before he could object further, she continued, Any dietary restrictions I should be aware of? No, ma'am, he replied, falling back on the manners his mother had drilled into him. Please, call me Alexandra. Until tomorrow then. And Matthew, thank you for calling. The line went dead before he could respond. Matthew set the phone down slowly, staring at it as if it might explain what had just happened. Alexandra Blackwood, CEO of whatever Blackwood Agricultural Enterprises was coming to his farm. For dinner. With a business proposition. He looked around his kitchen with new eyes, seeing the chipped countertops, the ancient refrigerator humming in the corner, the linoleum floor with its worn path from stove to sink. The rest of the house wasn't much better functional but shabby, every surface telling the story of financial struggle. For a wild moment, he considered calling her back to cancel. But pride stopped him. This was his home, his life. If Alexandra Blackwood wanted to talk business, she could take him as he was, or not at all. Still, he spent the remainder of the day, and much of the next, in a cleaning frenzy he hadn't experienced since his mother's last visit 5 years ago. He scrubbed floors, washed windows, and even managed to fix the dripping faucet that had been his companion through many late-night worries. The outside of the house remained a testament to his financial situation, but at least the inside would be presentable. At precisely 6 o'clock the following evening, the crunch of tires on his gravel driveway announced her arrival. Matthew had been pacing for the past half hour, alternating between convincing himself this was a waste of time and cautious hope that whatever Alexandra Blackwood had in mind might actually help his situation. The vehicle that pulled up wasn't the Range Rover he'd rescued from the mud, but a more practical pickup truck, still new and expensive looking, but at least somewhat appropriate for the rural setting. Matthew stepped onto the porch, wiping suddenly sweaty palms against his freshly laundered jeans. Alexandra emerged from the truck with the same composed grace she'd shown in the rainstorm. She wore dark jeans again, paired with a simple blouse and lightweight jacket. Her hair was loose this time, falling in dark waves past her shoulders. She looked like she could be heading to a casual dinner in the city rather than a business meeting at a failing farm. In her hands, she carried what appeared to be an insulated bag, presumably containing the promised dinner. "Good evening, Matthew," she called, approaching the porch with confident strides. "I hope I'm not late." "Right on time," he replied, stepping forward to take the bag from her. It was heavier than he expected. "I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I brought options," she explained, following him into the house. If she noticed the signs of hasty cleaning or the underlying shabbiness, she gave no indication. Inside, Alexandra moved with the ease of someone accustomed to adapting to new environments. She took in the kitchen with an appreciative glance that somehow managed not to seem judgmental. "This house has character," she commented, running a hand along the edge of the kitchen table. "How old is it?" "Main structure was built in 1892, Matthew answered, unpacking the bag to find several containers of still warm food from a restaurant he recognized as one of the Bullas, most expensive in the nearest town. "My great-great-grandfather built it. We've added on over the years. It feels solid, grounded." She moved to the window, looking out at the fields beyond. "You can see the whole eastern section from here. Good vantage point." The comment surprised him. Most visitors commented on the house's age or the creaking floors, not its strategic positioning relative to the fields. "My grandfather used to say he could tell when a storm was coming just by looking out this window," Matthew said, finding plates in the cabinet. "Something about how the light hit the east ridge." Alexandra turned from the window with a smile. "Men like your grandfather understood the land in ways most modern farmers have forgotten. That kind of knowledge is invaluable." There was something about her tone, earnest, almost reverent, that made Matthew pause in his task. She spoke like someone who actually understood farming, not just as a business, but as a way of life. "You know something about agriculture," he observed, setting the plates on the table. "I should hope so," she replied with a small laugh. "My company specializes in sustainable agricultural development. But before that, I grew up on my family's farm in Vermont. Smaller than this, but similar in many ways." This revelation shifted Matthew's perception of her. Not just a corporate executive with family money, but someone who might actually understand the soil beneath her fingernails. Shall we eat while we talk? Alexandra suggested, gesturing to the food he'd laid out. Everything will taste better warm. They settled at the table, and for a few minutes, conversation paused as they filled their plates with expertly prepared steak, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread that put Matthew's usual meals to shame. He tried not to appear too eager, but it had been a long time since he'd eaten food of this quality. So, he said finally, setting down his fork. You mentioned a business proposition. Alexandra nodded, taking a sip of water before responding. Direct. I appreciate that. She placed her glass down deliberately. Matthew, what do you know about heirloom crop cultivation? The question wasn't what he expected. Some. My grandfather kept heritage corn and tomato varieties going. I've maintained a few, but mostly switched to commercial strains. Better yields generally. Better short-term yields, she corrected. She corrected. Gently. But at what cost? Decreased flavor, reduced nutritional value, greater dependence on chemical inputs, and increasing vulnerability to disease and climate shifts. It was an argument he'd heard before, usually from idealistic organic farmers who didn't understand the financial realities of modern agriculture. Those heirloom varieties might taste better, he countered, but they don't pay the bills. Lower yields, more susceptibility to pests, more labor-intensive. All valid points, Alexandra agreed, surprising him. If you're selling into conventional markets at conventional prices. She leaned forward slightly. But what if you weren't? Matthew frowned. What are you suggesting? Blackwood Agricultural Enterprises has been developing partnerships with small and medium-sized farms across the region. We're creating a network of heritage crop producers with guaranteed purchase. Contracts at premium prices. Sounds too good to be true, Matthew said skeptically. What's the catch? Alexandra smiled. Not a catch so much as a commitment. We require strict adherence to organic practices, detailed documentation of growing methods, and exclusive sale of heritage varieties to our network. In return, we provide upfront capital for transition costs, ongoing technical support, and those guaranteed contracts I mentioned. Matthew sat back in his chair, studying her face for signs of deception. Why me? Why this farm? Several reasons, Alexandra replied, meeting his gaze directly. Your land has been continuously farmed for generations, without the intensive chemical applications used on neighboring properties. That means less remediation required for organic certification. You have experience with heritage varieties, even if limited. And frankly, Matthew, I saw how you handled that tractor in terrible conditions. You know this land intimately. She paused, then added more softly. And I know you're in financial trouble. The bank has already started foreclosure proceedings. Matthew stiffened. How do you know that? It's public record, she replied calmly. And, in a community this size, word travels. I make it my business to know which farms might be receptive to new opportunities. Anger flared briefly at the exposure of his failure, at the thought that she might be using his desperation against him. But pragmatism quickly followed. His situation wasn't a secret, and if she had resources that could help, what exactly would this partnership look like? He asked cautiously. Alexandra's expression brightened. From her jacket pocket, she produced a slim folder and placed it on the table between them. This is just a preliminary outline, she said as he opened it. We'd need to conduct soil tests, review your existing infrastructure, and develop a transition plan specific to your operation. But essentially, we would provide an immediate capital injection to address your most pressing financial concerns. Matthew scanned the document, his eyes widening at the figure listed under initial capitalization. This is, he began, then stopped, searching for words. Substantial, Alexandra finished for him. Yes, because what we're proposing is substantial as well. A complete transformation of your farming approach. The document detailed a 3-year transition plan, moving his operation from conventional crop production to specialized heritage varieties. The financial projections showed initial losses in year 1, breaking even in year 2, and then if these numbers were to be believed, significant profits by year 3. These profit margins seem optimistic, he said, pointing to the year 3 projections. They're based on our existing contracts with high-end restaurants, specialty food producers, and direct-to-consumer subscription services, Alexandra explained. The market for authentic, historically significant food varieties is growing rapidly. People want connection to their food, and they're willing to pay for it. Matthew continued reading, his farmer's pragmatism warring with growing interest. The technical aspects seem sound: crop rotation schedules, integrated pest management approaches, soil building practices. This wasn't some hippie dream, but a sophisticated agricultural system. You'd retain full ownership of your land, Alexandra continued, sensing his concerns. We'd enter into a 10-year contract with options to renew. You'd manage day-to-day operations with our technical support. We'd guarantee purchase of qualifying crops at the prices outlined on page 4. The prices listed were indeed substantially higher than what he currently received through conventional channels. Even with lower yields, the math could work. If these markets were really there, I'd need to talk to my accountant, Matthew said, closing the folder. And probably a lawyer. Of course, Alexandra agreed readily. I'd expect nothing less. We can provide references from other farmers in our network as well. And if I say no? Alexandra gathered her fork and knife, placing them neatly on her plate. Then we part as potential business partners, but hopefully remain friendly acquaintances. There's no pressure here, Matthew. We select our partners carefully, and they must select us with equal care. This relationship only works with mutual commitment. Her candor was refreshing, but Matthew remained cautious. Opportunities like this didn't just fall from the sky, especially not onto failing farms like his. Why do I feel like there's something you're not telling me? He asked directly. Alexandra studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if coming to a decision. There is one detail I haven't mentioned yet. It's not in the documents because it's still in development. Matthew waited, tension building in his shoulders. Blackwood is establishing a heritage seed bank and living museum on the old Henderson property adjacent to your eastern border. We're preserving agricultural biodiversity while educating the public about traditional farming practices. If you joined our network, your farm would be ideally positioned to serve as one of our demonstration sites. The Henderson property. Matthew knew it well, a once beautiful farm that had fallen into disrepair after old man Henderson died and his children sold to developers. There had been talk of luxury homes, but the development had stalled during the recession. You bought that land? The Blackwood Foundation did, yes. 3 months ago. And you want tourists tramping through my fields? School groups and busloads of retirees? Alexandra smiled. Carefully managed visitors on designated paths, with proper scheduling to avoid interference with farm operations. And those visitors represent additional revenue streams. Farm tours, workshops, direct sales of premium products. Our existing demonstration farms average an additional 30% income from these activities. The idea was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. Matthew had always valued his privacy, the solitude of working his fields. But the financial potential. This is a lot to take in, he said finally. I know, Alexandra acknowledged, and I don't expect an answer tonight. Take the material, review it with your advisors. Talk to our other farmers. Their contact information is included. I believe in transparency, Matthew. Ask any question, and I'll give you a straight answer. She reached into her pocket again, producing another business card, this one with a different number written on the back. This is Jordan Chen, my operations director. He can arrange site visits to our other partner farms, if you'd like to see this system in action. Matthew accepted the card, adding it to the folder. A thought occurred to him. Did you get stuck in the mud on purpose the other day? Was this all some elaborate setup? Alexandra laughed, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to brighten the kitchen. I assure you, my rental car being swallowed by your access road was not part of my business development strategy. Pure coincidence, though. Perhaps a fortunate one. She glanced at her watch. I should be going. I've given you plenty to consider, and you probably have evening chores waiting. Matthew nodded, rising from the table. I do need to check on the sheep before dark. Sheep? Alexandra looked intrigued. You didn't mention livestock operations. Just a small flock. My mother started them years ago. Heritage Cotswolds. Not really economical, but... He trailed off, not wanting to admit the sentimental attachment that kept him feeding animals that contributed little to the farm's bottom line. But family traditions matter, Alexandra finished for him, a knowing look in her eyes. Heritage breeds have their own market value, you know. We should discuss integrating them into the overall plan, if you decide to move forward. They walked to the door together, the folder of information tucked securely under Matthew's arm. As they stepped onto the porch, the setting sun cast long shadows across the fields, painting the landscape in gold and amber hues. Alexandra paused, taking in the view. It's beautiful here. You can feel the generations who've worked this land. The comment touched something deep in Matthew's heart, the very reason he'd struggled so hard to keep the farm going when logic said to sell. "Thank you for dinner," he said, suddenly aware of how abrupt he'd been earlier. "And for the proposal, I'll give it serious consideration. That's all I ask." She turned to face him fully, extending her hand. "Whatever you decide, Matthew, I'm glad we had this conversation." As they shook hands, Alexandra held his gaze with an intensity that suggested she understood exactly what was at stake for him, not just financially, but emotionally. For the first time in their brief acquaintance, Matthew felt they might actually be seeing each other clearly. After she drove away, he stood on the porch for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky. The folder in his hands might contain salvation for his family's legacy or a beautifully packaged trap. Either way, Alexandra Blackwood had just offered him something he hadn't had in a long time: hope. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Perfect weather for the spring work that desperately needed his attention. But Matthew found himself at his kitchen table instead. The contents of Alexandra's folder spread before him, along with his own financial records, a much more depressing collection of papers. He'd been up half the night, alternating between excitement at the potential opportunity and deep suspicion about its legitimacy. Now, in the brass, clear light of day, he was attempting a more methodical analysis. The numbers made a compelling case. Even with the most conservative yield estimates, the guaranteed contract prices would eventually surpass his current revenue. The transition period would be tight, very tight, but if Blackwood Agricultural Enterprises delivered on the promised capital infusion, he could make it work. A knock at the door interrupted his calculations. Matthew frowned, not expecting visitors. His nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away and rarely came calling. Opening the door, he was surprised to find a man in his 50s, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He had the weathered face and calloused hands of a lifelong farmer. "You must be Matthew Harmon," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Frank Wilson. I farm about 40 miles north of here, near Riverdale." The name clicked in Matthew's mind. He'd seen it on the reference list in Alexandra's folder. "You're with Blackwood's program," Matthew said, shaking the man's hand. Frank nodded. "Going on 3 years now." Alexandra called. "Said you might have questions. Thought I'd save you the drive and come see you myself." Matthew hesitated only briefly before stepping back from the door. "Come in. Coffee?" "Wouldn't say no," Frank replied, entering the house with the comfortable ease of one farmer visiting another. As Matthew poured the coffee, Frank surveyed the kitchen with an appraising eye. "Solid place you got here. Reminds me of my grandfather's house." "Been in the family a long time," Matthew replied, setting a mug before his unexpected guest. "So, you're actually part of this heritage crop program?" Frank wrapped weathered hands around the mug. "Partner farm number 3, as Alexandra likes to say." Was about to lose everything when she showed up. Bank had already posted the foreclosure notice. The parallel to Matthew's situation wasn't lost on either of them. "And now?" Matthew prompted. "Now we grow 17 varieties of heritage grains, plus specialty potatoes and root vegetables. I'm clearing more than double what I made in my best year under conventional methods." Frank took a sip of his coffee. "But I won't lie to you. The transition was rough. First year, I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life." Matthew appreciated the honesty. "What changed?" "Everything started working the way they said it would. The soil improved faster than expected. The specialty markets materialized. The premium prices were real. Frank leaned forward. Look, I was suspicious too. Thought there had to be a catch. 3 years in, I'm still waiting to find it. For the next hour, Frank answered Matthew's questions with the practical specificity that only a fellow farmer could provide. He detailed challenges in pest management without chemical interventions, described the learning curve of working with unfamiliar crop varieties, and outlined the documentation requirements that Matthew had worried might be burdensome. It's not a magic solution, Frank concluded as they finished their coffee. You'll work just as hard, maybe harder at first, but you'll be building something sustainable, environmentally and financially. My son's coming back to the farm next year after college. Wasn't interested before. Now, he sees a future in it. That, more than any profit projection, caught Matthew's attention. Though he had no children of his own, the thought that his family's farm might have a future beyond him was powerful. Can I see your operation? Matthew asked suddenly. I'd like to see how this works in practice. Frank smiled. That's why I'm here. Thought you might want a tour from someone who's been in your shoes. I'm free all day if you are. By noon, they were walking Frank's fields, which showcased a diversity of crops that Matthew had never seen on a single farm. Ancient varieties of wheat grew alongside heirloom corn, their different heights and colors creating a tapestry across the landscape. In specialized high tunnels, rare vegetable varieties thrived in carefully maintained conditions. What struck Matthew most wasn't just the crops, but the soil itself, dark, rich, and teeming with life. After years of fighting against depleted land, the sight of such health was almost shocking. We built this soil, Frank said proudly, crumbling a handful between his fingers. 3 years ago, it was nearly dead from decades of chemical farming. Now look at it. The farmhouse and buildings told a similar story of renewal. New metal roofs gleamed in the sun, and solar panels provided power for the operation. Inside a renovated barn, specialized cleaning and packaging equipment prepared crops for their premium markets. Blackwood financed all the upgrades, Frank explained as they toured the processing facility. Initial investment was about what they're offering you, adjusted to the size of my operation. I pay it back gradually through the contract, but at terms no bank would match. By the time they returned to Frank's farmhouse for a late lunch, Matthew's mind was racing with possibilities. Over homemade sandwiches, Frank's wife Sarah joined them, adding her perspective on how the partnership had transformed not just their farm, but their entire way of life. We were working ourselves to death, and still failing, she said bluntly. Now we work hard, but with purpose, and we actually have time to live. She gestured toward family photos on the wall, recent ones showing gatherings and celebrations that spoke of prosperity returning to a family that had known struggle. On the drive back to his own farm, Matthew sat in contemplative silence beside Frank. The evidence before his eyes was compelling. This program appeared to be everything Alexandra had claimed, and perhaps more. One last question, Matthew said as they neared his property. Why is she doing this? Alexandra Blackwood could be running any business, making money in simpler ways. Why heritage agriculture? Frank considered the question carefully before answering. I asked her that once. She said something about how preserving agricultural diversity was the most important work of our time, that someday these forgotten crops might save us all. He shrugged. But personally, I think it goes deeper. The way she talks about farming, about connection to the land, it's personal for her. After Frank departed with a hearty handshake and an open invitation to call any time, Matthew found himself standing on his porch, looking out over fields that suddenly seemed full of untapped potential rather than burdensome responsibility. The decision wasn't simple. Partnership meant surrendering some independence, adapting to new methods, and trusting Alexandra Blackwood's vision. Yet continuing alone meant almost certain failure within months. That evening, Matthew called his accountant, who reviewed the Blackwood proposal with professional skepticism that gradually gave way to cautious optimism. If their markets are real, he concluded, this could save your farm. But get everything in writing and have a lawyer review it. 2 days later, Matthew sat across from Alexandra in a conference room at Blackwood Agricultural Enterprises regional office. The space was modern but warm, with large windows overlooking experimental garden plots, where staff in straw hats tended unusual-looking plants. "You visited Wilson Farms," Alexandra observed, as they settled into comfortable chairs. Matthew wasn't surprised, she knew. "Frank gave me the tour. Impressive operation. Frank and Sarah have been wonderful partners. Their knowledge of traditional grain cultivation has been invaluable to our research division." Alexandra placed a leather portfolio on the table. "But you didn't come here to discuss the Wilsons. You've made a decision." It wasn't a question, but Matthew answered anyway. "I'm interested in moving forward, but I have conditions." Something that might have been respect flickered in Alexandra's eyes. "I'm listening." "I want a full soil analysis before committing, conducted by an independent lab of my choosing. I want the capital infusion structured as a partnership investment, not a loan. And I want a clause that allows me to buy out Blackwood's interest after the initial 10-year term, should I choose to." Alexandra nodded slowly. "All reasonable requests. The soil analysis is standard practice anyway. We would insist on it ourselves. As for the financial structure, we typically use the investment model you've described, with graduated buyback options beginning in year 7. She opened the portfolio and slid a document toward him. "This is our standard partnership agreement. You'll find most of your conditions already addressed, but your lawyer should review it and suggest any modifications you feel are necessary." Matthew accepted the document, somehow not surprised that she had anticipated his concerns. "There's one more thing," he said, meeting her gaze directly. "I want to understand your motivation. Why heritage agriculture? Why my farm?" Alexandra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she rose and walked to the window, looking out at the experimental gardens where ancient crop varieties were being rediscovered and preserved. "When I was a child," she began, her voice softer than he'd heard before, "my grandmother kept a garden behind our farmhouse in Vermont. It wasn't large, but she grew varieties you couldn't find anywhere else. Beans that had been in our family for generations, corn with kernels inbred, colors most people have never seen." She turned back to face him. "When she died, I was away at business school, becoming what my parents wanted, a proper Blackwood, ready to manage family investments and sit on corporate boards. By the time I returned home, the garden was gone, plowed under for a lot extension." Anger flashed briefly across her face at the memory. "I realized then that something precious was being lost not just in my family but everywhere. These heritage varieties aren't just quaint curiosities. They're repositories of genetic diversity built over thousands of years of human agriculture, and they're disappearing at an alarming rate." End quote. She returned to her seat, leaning forward with an intensity that caught Matthew off guard. "As for why your farm, I researched potential partners thoroughly. Your land has exceptional soil profiles despite years of conventional farming. Your family's agricultural records, which I accessed through the Historical Society, show a commitment to thoughtful stewardship even during the push toward industrial methods. And you've maintained some heritage varieties against all economic logic." "Wah." Matthew recalled the small plot behind his barn, where he still grew his grandfather's corn, a variety with red and blue kernels that made the best cornbread he'd ever tasted, but was too low yielding for commercial production. "That's why I got stuck in the mud that day," Alexandra continued with a small smile. "I was actually on my way to approach you formally when my GPS suggested that shortcut. Sometimes fate has a sense of humor." Her explanation had the ring of truth, and Matthew found himself nodding. "My grandfather used to say we don't own the land, we just borrow it from future generations." "Wise man," Alexandra replied. "That's essentially our philosophy as well, just dressed up in corporate language and backed by capital." She gestured to the document before him. "Take that home. Review it with your advisors. I'm not in a hurry, Matthew, but I suspect your bank might be." The gentle reminder of his financial reality stung, but he appreciated her directness. "I'll have an answer for you within the week," he promised, rising to leave. Alexandra walked into the door. "Before you go, would you be willing to show me that heritage corn variety you maintain? Our researchers would be very interested." The request, so specific and unexpected, confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. Alexandra Blackwood had done her homework on him and his farm with remarkable thoroughness. "How did you know about that?" "Local feed store owner mentioned it. Said your grandfather's corn made the best meal he'd ever ground. We've been trying to locate that variety for our seed bank." Of course she'd been asking about him in town. Matthew wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unnerved by her thorough approach. "Come by tomorrow afternoon," he found himself saying. "I'll show you the plot." True to her word, Alexandra arrived the following day, this time in a practical Jeep rather than her executive pickup. She'd dressed for field work in sturdy boots and a wide-brimmed hat that protected her face from the spring sun. The transformation from polished CEO to practical farmer was seamless, reinforcing Matthew's growing belief that her agricultural background was genuine. "The corn's this way," he said after greeting her, leading toward a small plot behind the main barn. "It's not much to look at this time of year, just getting started." The plot was indeed modest, perhaps a quarter-acre, separated from his main fields. Young corn plants, just inches tall, grew in neat rows, tended with obvious care, despite the financial pressure on the rest of the farm. Alexandra knelt beside the emerging plants, examining them with the practiced eye of someone who understood what she was seeing. Remarkable, the stem pigmentation suggests this might be related to the glass gem varieties, but the leaf structure is different. Matthew was impressed by her knowledge. Grandfather called it Harmon Red. Story goes his father traded a good hunting dog for the original seed with a Cherokee farmer passing through in the 1920s. "May I?" Alexandra asked, gesturing toward one of the plants. At Matthew's nod, she carefully brushed soil from around the base of a seedling, revealing its root structure without disturbing it. "Strong early development. Drought-resistant?" "Very. Handles dry spells better than any modern variety I've tried." "And the yield?" "About 60% of commercial hybrids in a good year. Taste makes up for it, though. And it stores well. Kernels remain viable for planting after 5 years if kept dry." Alexandra stood, brushing soil from her hands with an expression of genuine excitement. "This is exactly the kind of variety we're working to preserve, resilient, adapted to local conditions, with qualities that modern breeding has sacrificed for yield alone." Her enthusiasm was contagious, and Matthew found himself sharing details about the corn's growth habits, pest resistance, and culinary qualities that he rarely discussed with anyone. Alexandra listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small book she carried. "Would you consider allowing our researchers to document this variety? We'd provide full recognition to your family as the preservers, of course, and any commercial applications would include royalty arrangements." The question carried weight beyond its practical implications. It represented a first concrete step toward partnership. "I would," Matthew replied after a moment's consideration. "Grandfather would have liked knowing it wouldn't be lost." They walked the remainder of the farm together, with Matthew pointing out features of the land, the natural spring that had never failed even in drought years, the south-facing slope ideal for early plantings, the sheltered valley where delicate crops could be protected from harsh winds. Alexandra, in turn, highlighted potential areas for heritage crop development, suggesting varieties that might thrive in specific microclimates across his property. Her knowledge was impressive, blending scientific understanding with practical farming experience. As the afternoon light began to fade, they found themselves at the eastern edge of the property, looking toward the Henderson land that Blackwood had acquired. From this vantage point, they could see the bones of what had once been a beautiful farm, rolling fields, an old apple orchard now overgrown, a stately but deteriorating barn in the distance. "What exactly will this living museum involve?" Matthew asked, gesturing toward the neighboring property. "Restoration of the historic buildings, demonstration fields showing agricultural methods from different time periods, educational facilities for workshops and school groups." Alexandra pointed toward the orchard. "That's being restored already. 37 varieties of pre-1900 apples, some nearly extinct. The main visitor center will be where you see those construction vehicles, well away from your property line." The vision she described was ambitious, but thoughtfully planned. Matthew could see how his farm might complement such a facility, rather than being overwhelmed by it. "And if I sign on with your program, what changes first?" he asked as they turned back toward his house. "We start with soil remediation and infrastructure improvements. Fixing that leaking roof would be high on the list." She smiled as Matthew raised an eyebrow at her observation. The first growing season would be transitional, continuing some conventional crops while beginning heritage varieties on selected plots. By year 3, we'd aim for full conversion. As they reached his porch, the sun was setting behind the western hills, casting long shadows across fields that had supported his family for generations. The moment felt pivotal, as if the land itself was waiting for his decision. "I'll review the agreement tonight," Matthew said. "But I'm inclined to move forward." Alexandra offered her hand, and as they shook on this preliminary understanding, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time, the sense that he was moving towards something rather than merely struggling to hold back. "On to the past. I think your grandfather would approve," Alexandra said softly, as if reading his thoughts. After she left, Matthew sat on his porch until darkness fell completely, imagining his fields transformed not into something foreign, but perhaps into something closer to what they had once been, generations ago. The following week passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and careful deliberation. Matthew's lawyer, a shrewd country attorney who had served local farming families for decades, reviewed the Blackwood Agreement line by line, suggesting modifications that were accepted by Alexandra's team with surprising readiness. The soil tests came back, confirming what both Matthew and Alexandra had suspected: his land was exceptionally well suited for organic conversion, with fewer chemical residues than typical for a conventional operation. This advantage would shorten the transition period for organic certification, a crucial factor in the economic projections. By Friday, Matthew sat at his kitchen table with the final agreement before him, pen in hand. The document represented both an end and a beginning, the conclusion of his family's struggle to maintain a conventional farming operation in an economy stacked against small producers, and the start of a new approach that might preserve the land and legacy for future generations. With a deep breath, he signed his name on the indicated lines, committing to a partnership that would fundamentally change his farm and his life. 3 days later, the changes began. A team of workers arrived to repair his roof, not with cheap patches, but with quality materials meant to last decades. Soil scientists took additional samples across every field, creating detailed maps of nutrient profiles and microbial activity. Irrigation specialists evaluated his water systems, recommending improvements that would reduce consumption while increasing efficiency. Matthew worked alongside them all, learning new terminology and techniques, occasionally surprised by the respect these experts showed for his knowledge of the land. This wasn't a corporate takeover but a true collaboration, with his experience valued rather than dismissed. Alexandra visited regularly, sometimes with technical specialists, other times alone. During these solo visits, they would walk the fields together, discussing plans and possibilities with a growing ease that gradually shifted from professional to personal. "You never talk about your family," Matthew observed during one such walk, about a month into their partnership. "Other than that story about your grandmother's garden." Alexandra was silent for several steps before responding. "The Blackwoods are complicated. Old money, older expectations. I was something of a disappointment when I chose agriculture over finance or law. Seems like you've built something impressive regardless," Matthew noted. "It took time and distance." She gestured toward the valley spreading below them. "This work preserving agricultural heritage, supporting family farms, it matters in ways that managing hedge funds never could. My parents don't fully understand, but they've stopped trying to redirect my career. My why and personal life?" The question slipped out before Matthew could reconsider its appropriateness. Alexandra glanced at him with a hint of surprise. "Neglected mostly. Building this company has been all-consuming." She paused, then added with a small smile, "Why do you ask?" Matthew felt suddenly awkward. "Just curious. You know pretty much everything about me, but you're still something of a mystery." "Fair observation." She changed the subject smoothly, pointing toward a field where new irrigation was being installed. "How are you finding the transition so far?" Matthew allowed the deflection, recognizing boundaries he perhaps shouldn't have approached. Overwhelming at times, but good. Your people know their stuff, and they actually listen when I talk about this land's quirks. That's by design. Local knowledge is invaluable, something industrial agriculture forgot to its detriment. As spring turned to summer, the transformation of Harmon Farm accelerated. The first heritage crop plots were established, experimental at this stage, but promising. Ancient wheat varieties with deep roots broke through soil that had been compacted by years of conventional tillage. Rare bean varieties climbed trellises beside the restored barn. In carefully prepared beds, heirloom vegetables flourished under organic management protocols that emphasized soil health above all. Matthew's days grew longer, but somehow less burdensome. The physical work remained challenging, but the constant anxiety about finances had lifted. The Blackwood investment had cleared his immediate debts, and operating funds ensured he could focus on farming rather than barely surviving. More surprising was the change in Matthew himself. Friends and neighbors commented on his renewed energy, the return of enthusiasm that had been crushed under years of financial struggle. He found himself looking forward to Alexandra's visits, not just for their professional value, but for the conversations that increasingly ranged beyond farming to books. Travel, philosophy, and personal histories shared over coffee on his porch or dinner in the kitchen he had slowly begun to renovate. By late summer, the first small harvests of heritage crops were ready. Matthew watched with pride as specialized crews carefully gathered varieties that had not been commercially grown in the region for generations. The produce was exquisite vegetables with complex flavors that supermarket versions could never match. Ancient grains with nutrition profiles superior to modern hybrids. True to their agreement, Blackwood's marketing team arranged for these initial harvests to be showcased at high-end restaurants throughout the region. Matthew found himself invited to these events, somewhat uncomfortable in settings, more formal than he was accustomed to, but gradually gaining confidence as chefs and diners expressed genuine appreciation for the unique qualities of his produce. At one such dinner, in a renowned farm-to-table restaurant in the nearest city, Matthew sat beside Alexandra as the chef presented a multi-course meal featuring heritage varieties from Harmon Farm and other Blackwood partners. To the revival of true flavor, the chef announced, raising a glass to Matthew and the other farmers present. And to those who preserve these treasures for future generations. The applause felt surreal recognition for work that most conventional agriculture had dismissed as impractical or irrelevant. Matthew glanced at Alexandra beside him, elegant in a simple black dress, but still essentially the same person who had knelt in his fields examining corn roots. "Is it always like this?" he murmured, as the attention shifted away from them. "The recognition?" Alexandra smiled. "This is just the beginning. Wait until you see what happens when consumers taste the difference and start demanding these varieties by name." Later that evening, as they walked from the restaurant to where Alexandra's driver waited, she asked, "How does it feel, seeing your first heritage harvest celebrated this way?" Matthew considered the question seriously. "Strange, good, but strange. 6 months ago, I was nearly bankrupt, growing commodities no one cared about as long as they were cheap. Now chefs are praising vegetables from my farm by name. Your grandfather would be proud," Alexandra said softly. His preservation of that corn variety was the spark for all of this. He'd be surprised, that's for sure. Matthew paused under a streetlight, studying Alexandra's face. "Thank you. Not just for the financial rescue, but for showing me another path. I'd forgotten that farming could be meaningful, valued, joyful." He finished simply. Something shifted between them. In that moment, a boundary crossed without words. Alexandra's expression softened, and for a breath, Matthew thought she might move closer. Instead, she glanced toward the waiting car. "I should get back. Early meeting tomorrow with investors." "Of course." Matthew stepped back slightly, unsure if he'd misread the moment. "But I'd like to continue this conversation," she added, meeting his eyes again. "Perhaps dinner at your place this weekend?" Just us, without business associates or promotional obligations. The invitation hung between them, its implications clear. Saturday? Matthew suggested. I'll cook this time. I'd like that. Alexandra's smile held warmth that had nothing to do with professional partnership. Good night, Matthew. As her car pulled away, Matthew stood for a moment in the quiet street, awareness dawning that the transformation of his farm might be only part of the change Alexandra Blackwood had initiated in his life. Saturday arrived with perfect late summer weather, clear skies, gentle breezes, and temperatures that hinted at the coming fall without surrendering summer's warmth. Matthew spent the morning harvesting vegetables from his personal garden, the small plot near the house that had always been separate from the farm's commercial operations. By afternoon, he found himself in the unfamiliar position of checking his appearance in the mirror more than once. Changing shirts twice, before settling on a simply styled button-down that Sarah Wilson had insisted on buying him after their first successful restaurant showcase. Farmers can look presentable too, she'd declared when he protested. At precisely 6, Alexandra's Jeep appeared in the driveway. She emerged carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a casual sundress that somehow managed to be both simple and elegant. Something smells wonderful, she commented as Matthew welcomed her onto the porch. Grandmother's recipe, he replied, leading her inside to a kitchen transformed from their first dinner months earlier. The ancient refrigerator had been replaced, the countertops refinished, and new cabinets installed, practical improvements funded by the initial Blackwood investment. Dinner was simple, but prepared with care. Roasted chicken with herbs from Matthew's garden, vegetables harvested that morning, and bread made from the first test batch of heritage wheat grown on his land. This is incredible, Alexandra said, after tasting the bread. The nutty flavor, you can't get this from modern wheat varieties. The mill had to adjust their settings to handle it properly, Matthew noted. Old grains have different characteristics. Your technicians were right about that. Our technicians, Alexandra corrected gently. You're part of this venture now, not just a recipient of services. They ate unhurriedly, conversation flowing naturally from farm operations to childhood memories to books they both enjoyed. Alexandra described traveling through Europe studying traditional farming methods, while Matthew shared stories of his grandfather's unconventional approach to agriculture that had sometimes put him at odds with neighbors. He sounds like someone I would have liked to know, Alexandra commented as they moved to the porch with coffee after dinner. A man ahead of his time, or perhaps behind it, in the best possible way. Both, probably, Matthew agreed, settling into one of the wooden rocking chairs his father had made decades earlier. He understood that new wasn't always better, but he wasn't afraid of change either. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching fireflies begin their evening display over the fields. The farm looked different now. Cover crops growing in fields once left bare after harvest, new structures housing specialized equipment, workers' vehicles parked near the rehabilitated barn where processing gar. Facilities were being installed. Does it still feel like your place? Alexandra asked softly, seeming to read his thoughts. It does, Matthew replied after consideration. Different, but still mine. Maybe more mine than it's been in years, actually. I was losing it before, not just to the bank, but to a system that was crushing everything my family built. Alexandra nodded. That's what we're trying to prevent, across all our partner farms. Preserving not just crops, but a way of life that values connection to the land. Is that really possible on a meaningful scale? We're just a handful of farms against industrial giants. Change happens gradually, then suddenly, Alexandra replied. Consumers are already shifting, demanding transparency, quality, connection to their food sources. The industrial system is efficient, but soulless people are beginning to recognize what's been lost. Her passion was evident, not just in her words, but in the animation of her features as she spoke. In the soft evening light, Matthew found himself studying her profile, struck by how naturally she fit into this setting despite her wealth and position. What? She asked, catching his gaze. Just thinking that you're not what I expected when a Blackwood showed up stuck in the mud on my access road. Alexandra laughed. And what did you expect? Someone more corporate, less willing to get soil under her fingernails. Disappointment or relief? She asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Definitely relief. Matthew hesitated, then added, though it does make things more complicated. Complicated how? The question hung between them as Matthew searched for the right words. Professional relationships have clearer boundaries than whatever this is becoming. Alexandra set her coffee cup down, turning to face him fully. And what do you think this is becoming, Matthew? The directness of her question, so characteristic of her approach to everything, left no room for equivocation. Something more than a business partnership, he answered honestly. At least for me. Alexandra held his gaze steadily. For me as well. The admission, simple as it was, shifted the atmosphere between them. Matthew was acutely aware of how unusual their situation was. The struggling farmer and the wealthy CEO, worlds apart in many ways yet connected by shared values and growing personal attraction. Is that a problem? He asked. For your company, I mean. My board might have opinions, Alexandra acknowledged. But I've never allowed others to dictate my personal choices. The question is whether it's a problem for you, the power imbalance inherent in our business relationship. Her awareness of this dynamic impressed him. I've been thinking about that. 6 months ago, it would have been impossible. You held all the cards, and I was drowning. But now the farm is stabilizing. I'm standing on my own feet again, even if with your company's support. I can make choices based on what I want, not just what I need. Alexandra's expression softened. And what do you want, Matthew? Instead of answering with words, he reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand in his. The gesture was both question and statement, tentative yet clear in its intent. Alexandra responded by interlacing her fingers with his, her thumb tracing small circles against his palm. Complicated enough for you? She asked with a smile that held both warmth and challenge. I can handle complicated, Matthew replied, returning her smile. Spent my whole life figuring things out as I go. They remained that way for a time, hands joined, watching darkness settle over the farm as stars emerged overhead. When Alexandra eventually moved, it was to stand and gently tug him up beside her. Show me the stars from the south field, she suggested. The one your grandfather said had the best view of the night sky. Surprised that she remembered this detail from one of his stories, Matthew led her along the familiar path, their hands still connected. The gesture felt simultaneously momentous and natural, a boundary crossed that perhaps had been dissolving since their first encounter. In the open field, far from any artificial light, the stars spread above them in spectacular array. Alexandra tilted her head back, taking in the view with evident wonder. City living makes you forget how magnificent this is, she murmured. One of the farm's best crops, Matthew replied. Never fluctuates in price or fails to yield. Alexandra laughed softly at his farmer's perspective. Poetry and practicality in one package. You continue to surprise me, Matthew Harmon. When she turned toward him, starlight reflected in her eyes. Matthew recognized the moment for what it was. A crossroads, a choice that would permanently alter the relationship they had built. His hand rose almost of its own accord, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. Alexandra leaned slightly into his touch, the invitation clear in her expression. Their first kiss was tentative, a careful exploration that quickly deepened as initial hesitation gave way to months of building attraction. When they finally drew apart, Matthew kept his arms around her waist, unwilling to completely break the connection. Still think you can handle complicated? Alexandra asked, her voice slightly breathless. More certain now, Matthew replied, drawing her closer again. Autumn brought the first major harvest at Heritage Crops from Harmon Farm. The yields were indeed lower than conventional varieties, as expected, but the quality was exceptional. Restaurants and specialty food producers competed for the limited supply, validating Alexandra's market projections. The transformation of the farm continued at an accelerated pace. The old farmhouse underwent careful renovation, preserving its historic character while adding modern amenities. New storage facilities with precise climate controls were constructed to handle the delicate heritage varieties. A small team of workers, all local, as Matthew had insisted, was trained in specialized cultivation techniques. Matthew and Alexandra's relationship evolved alongside these changes. They maintained professional boundaries during business hours, particularly when other Blackwood staff were present. But evenings and weekends increasingly found them together, sometimes at the farm, sometimes at Alexandra's surprisingly modest apartment in the city. Their worlds were merging gradually, each learning to navigate the other's environment. Matthew accompanied Alexandra to business functions where he was introduced as a key partner farmer, but was increasingly treated as something more. Alexandra spent long weekends at the farm, happily donning work clothes and participating in whatever tasks needed attention. By early winter, when the season's work had largely concluded, Matthew found himself contemplating a future he had never imagined. The farm was on solid footing now, though the full economic benefits of the Heritage Program wouldn't be realized for another year or two. His partnership with Blackwood had proven successful beyond his expectations. And yet, it was the personal transformation that struck him most profoundly. The desperate, isolated farmer who had pulled a stranger's car from the mud less than a year ago was gone, replaced by a man with renewed purpose and, most unexpectedly, love. The realization crystallized one December evening as he and Alexandra sat before the fireplace in his newly renovated living room, reviewing plans for the coming growing season. The business discussion had concluded, and they now sat in comfortable silence, Alexandra leaning against him as they watched flames dance among the logs. "Move in with me," Matthew said suddenly, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. Alexandra turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "Here? At the farm?" "Yes. You're here most weekends anyway, and you work remotely half the time." He took her hand, suddenly certain. "This place has always been home to me, but now it feels incomplete when you're not here." Alexandra was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than hesitant. "It's a significant step," she finally said. "For both of us. And there are practical considerations, my office commitments, the perception among other partner farmers. All logistical details," Matthew countered. "The real question is whether you want to." "I do," she answered without hesitation. "That's not the issue. But rushing could complicate things unnecessarily." Matthew couldn't help smiling. "When have we ever chosen the uncomplicated path?" Alexandra laughed, the sound warming him more than the fire. "Fair point. We seem to excel at making unconventional choices." "So make another one," he urged gently. "Say yes." She studied his face, her expression softening. "Let's compromise. I'll keep my apartment for now, but make this my primary residence beginning after the new year. Give us time to adjust, make any changes to the house we need to, and allow Blackwood's PR team to figure out how to handle the news." It was a practical solution, characteristic of Alexandra's approach to life. "I can work with that," Matthew agreed. "But no separate bedrooms for appearance's sake when your board members visit. If they're going to accept this, it should be on honest terms." "Agreed. No pretense." She sealed the arrangement with a kiss that started gently, but quickly deepened. Later, as Alexandra slept beside him, Matthew found himself thinking of his grandfather, the man who had taught him that the land was something to be cherished rather than exploited. He wondered what the old farmer would think of all that had happened, the partnership with Blackwood, the revival of heritage agriculture on Harmon's soil, and now this unexpected love that had grown from it all. He liked to think his grandfather would approve not just of the farm's salvation, but of the woman who had made it possible. Alexandra Blackwood might have been born to privilege, but she understood what truly mattered. She saw value in things the modern world had nearly forgotten, just as his grandfather had. As winter gave way to spring, Alexandra gradually transitioned to living primarily at the farm. The adjustment wasn't without challenges. Her work often required early departures for the city or late-night video conferences with international partners. Matthew sometimes found himself alone for days when her responsibilities took her to other Blackwood projects across the country. Yet for every challenge, there were moments of profound rightness. Alexandra in the garden at dawn, coffee in hand, as she studied emerging seedlings, working side by side during the season's first planting, hosting dinners for neighboring farmers, curious about the heritage program, planning the farm's future together late into the night. The Henderson property next door was transformed as well, with the living agricultural museum taking shape as spring advanced. Beautiful walking paths wound through demonstration fields, where crops from different historical periods grew side by side. The restored barn housed interactive exhibits, explaining traditional farming methods, while the original farmhouse became a visitor center and educational space. When the facility officially opened to the public in early summer, Matthew stood beside Alexandra during the ribbon-cutting ceremony, still somewhat uncomfortable in the spotlight, but proud of what they had accomplished together. This site demonstrates our commitment to preserving agricultural heritage for future generations, Alexandra told the gathered crowd of local officials, press, and community members. But equally important is the working partnership with Harmon Farm next door, where these heritage varieties are being grown commercially, proving that traditional agriculture can be economically viable in the modern world. The spotlight that turned to Matthew made him momentarily tense, but he found his voice. What we're doing isn't new. It's actually very old. It's about remembering what generations of farmers knew before us. That working with nature rather than against it produces food with integrity. That diversity in our fields means resilience in our food system. That some things shouldn't be sacrificed for efficiency alone. The applause that followed felt like validation, not just of their business model, but of the values that had guided Matthew's family for generations. Values that he and Alexandra now shared and were working to spread beyond a single farm. As summer progressed into a second harvest season, the tangible results of their partnership became increasingly evident. The heritage crops flourished, with yields improving as soil health continued to develop under organic management. Market demand exceeded supply, confirming Alexandra's business projections and ensuring the farm's financial stability. More subtle but equally important was the change in the land itself. Fields that had been depleted by conventional practices showed renewed vitality. Beneficial insects returned in greater numbers, natural pest control systems began to function again, and the entire farm ecosystem displayed a balance that had been missing for decades. Matthew observed these changes with a farmer's practiced eye and a growing sense that his grandfather had been right all along. The old methods, updated with modern understanding, weren't just nostalgic curiosities, but practical solutions to problems created by industrial agriculture. One evening in late summer, after a successful harvest day, Matthew and Alexandra walked the farm's perimeter together, a ritual they had developed to mark significant moments in their shared journey. The setting sun cast golden light across fields, now defined by diversity rather than monocropping. "I have something to show you," Alexandra said, as they approached the eastern boundary where their property met the Henderson land. She led him to a newly cleared area near the ancient oak that had served as a landmark for generations. There, a freshly installed stone marker bore an inscription, "The William Harmon Heritage Garden, preserving the agricultural legacy of 6 generations. Next spring, this will become a specialized breeding area for your grandfather's corn variety," Alexandra explained. "Our researchers have confirmed it has unique drought-resistant properties that could be crucial for adapting to changing climate conditions." Matthew stared at the marker, emotion tightening his throat. "You didn't tell me about this. I wanted it to be a surprise. The board unanimously approved naming the research program after your family. Your grandfather's corn will be the cornerstone of our climate resilience breeding project." Matthew reached out to touch the stone, tracing the carved letters of his grandfather's name. The gesture connected him to the past, while standing firmly in a future he could never have imagined a year ago. "Thank you," he said simply, words inadequate for the emotions swirling within him. Alexandra slipped her arm around his waist. "You preserved this heritage when there was no economic reason to do so. That deserves recognition." They stood together in the fading light, the farm spreading around them like a living testament to what could be accomplished when tradition and innovation worked in harmony. In that moment, Matthew felt the weight of 6 generations, not as a burden, but as a foundation upon which something new and vital was being built. "I have something for you too," he said finally, turning to face Alexandra. Though it wasn't planned for today. Reaching into his pocket, He withdrew a small box that had been his grandmother's simple wood, lovingly polished, containing a ring that had passed through generations of Harmon women. Alexandra's eyes widened as she recognized the significance of the gesture. "I had a whole speech planned," Matthew continued, suddenly nervous despite the certainty in his heart, "about how you came into my life when all seemed lost, how you saw value in what I thought was failing, how you never tried to change this place but instead helped reveal what it could become." He opened the box, revealing a ring with a simple design, a band of gold with small diamonds set in a pattern reminiscent of planted fields. "But what it comes down to is this. I love you, Alexandra, not because you saved the farm, but because you understood why it was worth saving. Will you marry me?" Alexandra took the box with hands that trembled slightly, an unfamiliar vulnerability in a woman usually so composed. She studied the ring for a long moment before looking up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My answer is yes," she said, her voice strong despite the emotion evident in her expression. "Not because this is the sensible next step in our relationship, but because I can't imagine my future without you in it." As Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if meant for her, he felt a sense of completion that transcended the moment. This wasn't just about two people committing to a shared life. It was about the continuation of something larger than themselves, a legacy of stewardship that would now extend into future generations. "It's beautiful," Alexandra said, examining the ring more closely. "Your grandmother's?" "And her mother's before her. Family legend says it was designed to look like fields seen from above." Alexandra smiled. "Farmers to the core, even in your jewelry." They sealed their engagement with a kiss as the first stars appeared above, witness to a promise made on land that had seen countless seasons of planting and harvest, struggle and abundance. The cycle would continue, but now, with a new chapter unfolding. News of their engagement spread quickly through the local community and the agricultural network Blackwood had developed. Reactions were mixed, but predominantly positive. Those who had seen Matthew and Alexandra working together over the past year recognized the genuine partnership they had formed, both professionally and personally. The Blackwood Board of Directors received the announcement with cautious acceptance, their initial concerns about potential conflicts of interest addressed by Alexandra's characteristically thorough approach. She had prepared detailed proposals for restructuring the farm's contractual relationship with the company, creating appropriate arm's-length transactions, while maintaining the collaborative spirit that had made their, quote, project successful. Wedding plans developed alongside preparations for the farm's third growing season under the Heritage Program. They agreed on a harvest celebration, a ceremony on the farm when the first crops had been gathered, combining their marriage with a traditional harvest festival that would include the entire community of partner farmers and local supporters. Throughout the spring, planting and summer tending, Matthew watched with pride as Alexandra seamlessly balanced her role as CEO with her growing connection to the farm. She had always understood agriculture intellectually and from her childhood experience, but now she was developing the bone-deep knowledge that came only from daily interaction with specific land. "You're becoming a true farmer," he observed one evening as they reviewed plans for the coming week, her suggestions for field rotation showing an intuitive grasp of the farm's unique characteristics. "I had a good teacher," she replied with a smile. "Though I suspect my board would prefer I remain more executive than agriculturalist." "How are they handling the transition?" Matthew asked, referring to the organizational changes Alexandra had implemented to accommodate their relationship. "Better than expected. The new management structure actually improves our operational efficiency." She set aside the papers she'd been reviewing. "And the foundation model for the Heritage Seed Bank resolves most of the conflict of interest concerns." Her solutions had been elegant, creating a nonprofit foundation to manage the seed preservation program while maintaining Blackwood Agricultural Enterprises as the commercial partner for participating Kai farms. The structure ensured that their personal relationship would not compromise the integrity of either mission. "You've thought of everything," Matthew said with admiration. "Not quite everything," Alexandra replied, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "There's still the question of what happens to my role long term. I can't run a global agricultural enterprise from a farm in the middle of nowhere forever." no matter how much I love being here with you. It was a concern they had discussed before without reaching a definitive solution: how to balance Alexandra's corporate responsibilities with their shared life on the farm. Matthew had always assumed she would eventually return to a more traditional executive schedule, with the farm as their weekend home rather than primary residence. "What are you thinking?" he asked, sensing she had been considering alternatives. "I'm thinking it might be time for me to step back from day-to-day operations at Blackwood and focus on strategic direction." Alexandra's tone was measured, as if testing the idea aloud. "Jordan Chen has essentially been running things whenever I'm here anyway. He could be promoted to COO, with me remaining as CEO but in a more advisory capacity." The suggestion surprised Matthew. "You'd be willing to do that? After building the company from the ground up?" "Part of leadership is knowing when to create space for others to lead," she replied. "Blackwood was never meant to be about me. It's about the mission. If the organization can thrive with me in a reduced role, that's success, not failure." Matthew considered her words, recognizing the wisdom in them, but also concerned about the personal sacrifice involved. "And what would you do with your newfound time? I can't see you content with being just a farmer's wife." Alexandra laughed. "Heaven forbid. No, I've been developing some ideas about educational outreach, using what we've learned to help other farming communities transition to more sustainable models. Perhaps a book, speaking amaze. Engagements, consulting work." The more she spoke about this potential future, the more animated she became, revealing that this was not a hasty consideration, but something she had been contemplating for some time. "You've been planning this," Matthew observed. "Exploring options," she corrected gently. "Nothing decided. It would be a significant change, not just for me but for us, for the company. I wanted to be certain before discussing it with you or the board." Matthew reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "Alexandra Blackwood, agricultural evangelist. It suits you. You think so?" There was a hint of vulnerability in her question, rare from a woman so typically assured. "I do. You've always been at your most passionate when sharing knowledge, rather than just implementing it. And selfishly, I love the idea of having you here more consistently. It would mean some travel," she cautioned. "Speaking engagements, consulting with other farming communities. But the farm would be home base, not just a weekend retreat." The vision she described resonated with him. Both of them centered at Harmon Farm, but reaching outward to share what they had learned, each in their own way. It represented a balance of tradition and innovation that had defined their relationship from the beginning. "I think you should pursue it," Matthew said. "If it's what you truly want." "I'm still thinking it through," Alexandra replied, though her expression suggested the idea had already taken root. "Let's get through the wedding and harvest first. Major life changes are best tackled one at a time." As summer progressed toward autumn, wedding preparations intensified alongside harvest planning. The farm had never looked more beautiful: heritage crops, ripening in diverse hues across fields once dominated by monoculture. New structures harmonizing with historic buildings, the entire property exuding vitality that visitors frequently commented on. The living museum next door had become regionally famous, attracting school groups, agricultural students, and tourists interested in food heritage. Many visitors made their way to Harmon Farm as well, particularly during scheduled tour days when Matthew or Alexandra would demonstrate specialized growing techniques for heritage varieties. 2 weeks before the wedding, as the first crops were being harvested, Alexandra's parents arrived from Boston, their first visit to the farm, despite multiple invitations over the past year. Elliot and Margaret Blackwood were exactly as Matthew had imagined them: impeccably dressed, unfailingly polite, and visibly uncomfortable in the rural setting. "So this is where you've been hiding yourself," Margaret commented, as Alexandra showed them around the farmhouse, her tone suggesting a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. "Not hiding, mother, working," Alexandra replied with practiced patience. "Creating something important." Elliot Blackwood surveyed the renovated space with a businessman's assessing eye. "The improvements are substantial. Good craftsmanship." It was as close to approval as Matthew expected from Alexandra's father, a man who had built his fortune in real estate development and international finance. Matthew did much of the woodwork himself, Alexandra said, her pride evident. He restored all the original details while integrating modern systems. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. You're handy, as well as a farmer, Mr. Harmon? How versatile. Matthew recognized the subtle condescension, but chose to ignore it. Necessity taught me a lot of skills over the years. Farmers can't always afford specialists for every job. Dinner that evening was a study in contrasts, fresh food harvested that day from their fields, served in the simple farmhouse dining room to guests more accustomed to five-star restaurants. The conversation remained politely distant until Alexandra deliberately steered it toward the Heritage Crop Program's economic impact. The premium markets are expanding faster than projected, she explained, slipping into her executive persona. Return on investment is tracking 20% above our original models. Elliot Blackwood's attention sharpened noticeably. Those are impressive numbers for agricultural ventures. Sustainable? The demand for authentic heritage varieties is just beginning, Alexandra continued. As consumers become more educated about flavor profiles and nutritional differences, we expect continued growth for at least the next decade. Gradually, as the discussion focused on business metrics and market projections, the elder Blackwoods became more engaged. By the time Matthew served coffee, Elliot was asking detailed questions about scaling potential, while Margaret inquired about consumer demographics with genuine interest. You've created something remarkable here, Elliot finally acknowledged, addressing both Matthew and Alexandra. Not at all what I expected when you first described this project. What did you expect, Father? Alexandra asked. Frankly, an expensive hobby farm, a well-intentioned but impractical experiment. He gestured toward the window, where the last light illuminated productive fields stretching to the horizon. This is clearly much more. Matthew deserves most of the credit, Alexandra said firmly. His knowledge of this land, his willingness to adapt traditional methods, that's what made this successful. Partners in the truest sense, it seems, Margaret observed, her gaze moving between them with new consideration. Perhaps this marriage makes more sense than we initially thought. It wasn't wholehearted blessing, but it represented significant progress from their initial reaction to the engagement announcement. Matthew caught Alexandra's eye across the table, sharing a moment of quiet triumph. After her parents retired to the guest room, Alexandra joined Matthew on the porch, leaning against him with a sigh that released tension she had been carrying all evening. That went better than expected, she murmured. Your father almost seemed impressed by the end, Matthew agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. He respects results if nothing else, and the numbers don't lie. What we're doing here is working. She looked up at him. Thank you for being so patient with them. They're trying, in their way, and they raised an extraordinary daughter, so they must have done something right. Alexandra laughed softly. Diplomatic as well as handsome. I chose well. The following days brought more wedding guests. Partner farmers from the Blackwood Network, local friends who had supported Matthew through difficult years, agricultural researchers who had worked with Alexandra on various career projects. The farm hummed with activity as harvest operations continued alongside wedding preparations. On the evening before the ceremony, Alexandra found Matthew in the small plot where his grandfather's corn grew, now expanded to become the centerpiece of the heritage breeding program. He stood among the tall stalks, multicolored ears ripening in the late summer sun, looking toward the stone marker that bore his family name. Having second thoughts? She asked lightly, though her eyes studied his expression with care. Just the opposite, he replied, drawing her to his side. Thinking about how much he would have loved seeing this, not just the corn being preserved, but everything else we've accomplished. Tell me about him again, Alexandra requested, leaning her head against Matthew's shoulder. Stubborn as the day is long, suspicious of anything new until you could prove it worked, but also the most forward-thinking farmer I've ever known in some ways. Matthew smiled at memories that no longer brought pain. He used to say farming wasn't a job, or even a business. It was a conversation with the land that had been going on for generations. A conversation, Alexandra repeated thoughtfully. I like that. It suggests both parties have something to contribute. That's exactly how he saw it. The land speaks if you listen carefully enough. Our job is to respond appropriately, not just impose our will. End. They stood in companionable silence, the corn rustling gently around them as evening breezes stirred the tall stalks. Tomorrow they would formalize their partnership before friends and family, but Matthew felt they had already created something more meaningful than any ceremony could capture, a shared vision that honored the past while building toward the future. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked after a time. Alexandra nodded, her expression serene. "More than ready. Though I suspect my mother is still hoping I'll change my mind about wearing her designer gown instead of Sarah Wilson's handmade dress." "Sarah would never forgive you," Matthew laughed. "She's put her heart into that dress, and it's perfect, simple, practical, beautiful, like everything about this place." As darkness fell, they walked hand in hand back toward the farmhouse, now illuminated with strings of lights in preparation for the next day's celebration. The contrast between this moment and their first meeting, a rain-soaked farmer helping a stranded motorist, seemed almost impossible to reconcile. Yet the connection had been forming even then, though neither could have predicted its outcome. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, ideal weather for the harvest celebration they had planned. The ceremony would take place in the afternoon beside the ancient oak that marked the boundary between Harmon Farm and what was now the Blackwood Heritage Center, a symbolic location representing the union of their separate worlds. Matthew spent the morning with Frank Wilson and other farmer friends, overseeing final preparations while trying to distract himself from mounting nerves. It wasn't marriage itself that concerned him. His commitment to Alexandra was the surest thing in his life, but rather the public nature of the celebration, with guests ranging from local farmers to corporate executives and agricultural dignitaries. "Relax," Frank advised as they inspected the seating area one final time. "Remember, most of these folks are here because they respect what you two have built together. The rest don't matter." This simple wisdom helped settle Matthew's thoughts. By the time he took his place beneath the oak, dressed in a new suit that somehow managed to feel comfortable despite its formality, he felt centered and ready. The gathered guests, nearly 200 in total, created an unusual but striking assembly. Weathered farmers in their Sunday best sat alongside corporate executives and research scientists. Local families who had known Matthew since childhood mingled with visitors from across the country who had participated in the Heritage Crop Program. When Alexandra appeared, walking from the farmhouse with her father beside her, a hush fell over the gathering. Her dress was exactly as Sarah had designed it. Simple linen and warm ivory, embroidered with delicate representations of heritage, wheat and corn around the hem and sleeves. Her only jewelry was her grandmother's pendant and the engagement ring that had belonged to Matthew's grandmother. As she joined him beneath the oak tree, Matthew saw in her eyes the same certainty he felt that whatever challenges life might bring, they would face them together, their partnership already proven through trials and triumphs. Shared. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with traditional vows supplemented by promises specific to their unique relationship. They pledged not only to care for each other, but to continue the work they had begun, preserving agricultural heritage, supporting family farms, and maintaining the conversation with the land that had sustained generations before them. As they exchanged rings, the sun broke through clouds that had briefly gathered, casting dappled light through the oak's spreading branches, a moment so perfectly timed it drew murmurs from the assembled guests. "The land approves," Frank Wilson whispered to his wife, just loudly enough for Matthew to hear and smile. The celebration that followed embodied everything they valued: abundant food harvested from their fields and prepared by partner farmers, music from local musicians, and conversations that bridged worlds normally separated by economic and social boundaries. Corporate executives discussed crop rotation with third-generation farmers, while research scientists exchanged ideas with practical growers whose knowledge came from decades of hands-on experience. Late in the evening, as guests continued to celebrate under strings of lights illuminating the farmyard, Matthew and Alexandra slipped away to the porch of the farmhouse, their first private moment as husband and wife. "Happy?" Matthew asked, drawing her close. "Completely," she replied, her eyes reflecting the distant lights of the celebration. "Though I suspect we've created something that will take on a life of its own. Did you see my father deep in conversation with Frank Wilson about heritage grain economics?" Matthew laughed. "And your mother getting a sourdough starter lesson from Sarah. Worlds colliding. In the best possible way." Alexandra leaned against him, contentment evident in every line of her body. "This is just the beginning, you know. What we've started here, it could spread, change how people think about agriculture and food. One farm at a time," Matthew agreed. "Speaking of which, have you told your board about your decision yet?" In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Alexandra had finalized her plans to step back from daily operations at Blackwood Agricultural Enterprises, transitioning to a strategic role that would allow her to focus on educational outreach while making the farm their primary residence. "Meeting scheduled for next week," she confirmed. "Jordan is prepared for the transition, and the succession plan is solid. I think they'll be supportive, especially after seeing the success of this operation firsthand today." The future they envisioned was taking shape, a life centered at Harmon Farm, but extending outward through their shared commitment to agricultural revival. Alexandra would travel periodically for speaking engagements and consulting projects, while Matthew would manage the farm's ongoing development as a showcase for heritage agriculture. "We should rejoin the party," Alexandra said after a moment, though she made no move to leave the comfort of his embrace. "They won't miss us for a few more minutes," Matthew replied, content to hold this moment a little longer, this perfect balance point between what had been and what was to come. From their vantage point on the porch, they could see the entire farm spread before them. Fields now diversified with heritage varieties, the carefully restored barn housing specialized equipment for seed preservation, new structures, harmonizing with historic buildings in a blend of tradition and innovation that characterized everything they had created together. It was still Harmon Farm, carrying the legacy of 6 generations, but it had become something more as well, a living demonstration that the wisdom of the past could be integrated with the knowledge of the present to create a more resilient future. As they eventually returned to their wedding celebration, walking hand in hand beneath stars that had witnessed countless seasons of planting and harvest on this land, Matthew reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun with a simple act of kindness, pulling a stranger's car from the mud, had evolved into a partnership that had not only saved his family's farm, but positioned it to thrive for generations to come. And Alexandra, once the wealthy stranger with unexpected mud on her expensive boots, had found in this place and this man something her privileged life had never provided: a sense of purpose rooted in tangible connection to the land and its rhythms. Together, they had created something neither could have accomplished alone, a model of what farming could be when tradition and innovation worked in harmony, when the wisdom of the past was valued alongside the knowledge of the present. As they rejoined their guests under twinkling lights, surrounded by the abundance of their first shared harvest, the future stretched before them, not without challenges, certainly, but rich with possibility. The struggling farmer and the wealthy landowner had found in each other not just personal happiness, but a shared vision worth building, one careful season at a time. And the land, which had sustained generations of Harmons through good years and bad, would continue its ancient conversation with those who tended it now, with new voices added to the dialogue, new methods harmonizing with old wisdom, creating a symphony that would endure long after they were gone. In that moment, beneath stars that had witnessed countless human stories unfold on this small patch of earth, Matthew and Alexandra shared a look of perfect understanding. They were precisely where they were meant to be, their separate paths having converged to create something neither could have imagined that rainy day, when a luxury SUV became stuck in the mud of a country road, and a struggling farmer went to help without expecting anything in return. Some might call it fate or coincidence, but Matthew preferred his grandfather's perspective. Good stewardship tends to be rewarded, even if rarely in the ways we anticipate. The land remembers those who care for it properly, and sometimes, when we're fortunate, it brings us exactly what we need, precisely when we need it most.